You are accused of a crime, not a minor infraction, but something serious. Theft of livestock, maybe, or a killing in a brawl that you swear was self-defense. It is the year 900, and you live in a village in what will eventually become England. Someone has pointed a finger at you, and the community has gathered to decide what happens next. There is no police station, no lawyer, no cell waiting at the end of this afternoon. What happens next depends entirely on which century you are unlucky enough to be standing in. For most of recorded human history, every answer to that question came down to the same problem. Someone had to put a price on what you had done, and someone had to decide who got to set it. The systems that emerged from that problem, across 1,000 years of criminal justice in the Western world, were stranger and more brutal than most people know. And the modern prison, the thing that replaced all of them, is younger than the United States Constitution. The first system had a name for the price. It was called wergild. If you killed someone in 9th century Anglo-Saxon England, your family owed their family a fixed sum, set by royal law and published in the Dooms of Alfred, King Alfred's legal code. Pay it and the matter is closed. No further vengeance legally permitted. The system existed because the alternative was the blood feud. In the late 10th century, a nobleman named Wulfbald refused to pay the wergild for a killing his family had committed. The dead man's widow went to King Ethelred. The king ordered payment. Wulfbald ignored him. By the time the Archbishop of Canterbury intervened, 16 people were dead. That was wergild working. The Dooms of Alfred covered more than murder. Every harm to a body had a rate. A front tooth cost more than a back tooth because a front tooth was visible, and visibility had social meaning. The index finger cost more than the little finger because the index finger drew a bow. There was a separate entry for injuring a man's hearing, another for damaging his speech. The law was not vague. It was a ledger, and it was not uniquely English. Legal historians have documented nearly identical compensation structures in Norse law, Frankish law, and the early codes of Germanic peoples across Europe who had no documented contact with Anglo-Saxon England. The man price, in one form or another, was the default answer to criminal justice across an entire continent for several centuries. When independent civilizations arrive at the same solution without communicating, that is usually a signal that the solution was doing something genuinely necessary. Wergild was doing something necessary. It was also doing something its designers either did not see or chose not to acknowledge. The price of a man was not the same for every man. A free Saxon peasant was worth 200 shillings. A thane was worth 1,200. A Welsh person living under Anglo-Saxon rule was worth less than half the equivalent Saxon of the same social standing. Under the late 7th century laws of King Ine of Wessex, slaves had no wergild at all. Their market value was paid to their owner, not their family, because legally they had no family, only a master. A wealthy man who killed someone could pay and walk. A poor man who could not raise the required sum faced a blood feud, enslavement as a debt settlement, or outlawry. Outlawry was not a metaphor. A person declared an outlaw was given a specific legal status in Anglo-Saxon and early Norman England, caput lupinum, a wolf's head. It meant that anyone who encountered them could kill them on sight, without consequence, and in some jurisdictions, claim a reward for doing so. They had no wergild because they had no legal existence. The king's peace did not extend to them. They could not own property, appear in court, or call on anyone for protection. The system that was supposed to prevent cycles of violence had a category built into it for people it had simply decided were not worth protecting. There was also a problem no price table could touch. What do you do when no one admits guilt? There are no witnesses, and both parties swear opposite things. Wergild required an agreed offender. When there was none, the ledger had no entry for it. That problem was handed to God. In a church in 9th century England, an accused thief swore he did not do it. No witnesses. A priest lifted a length of iron from a fire, said a prayer over it, and placed it in the man's hands. He carried it 9 feet. Then his hand was wrapped in cloth, and he was told to return in 3 days. If the wound was healing cleanly, God had declared him innocent. If it had festered, God had declared him guilty. Trial by ordeal. Judicium Dei in Latin, the judgment of God. Not considered barbaric at the time, considered the only reliable procedure available for a problem that human judgment could not resolve. God was present in the world. God knew who was guilty. God would not allow an innocent person to be destroyed. The wound was not a punishment. It was the answer to a question that Wergild could not ask. The ordeal of hot iron was one form. The ordeal of boiling water required plunging a hand into a cauldron and retrieving a stone from the bottom, with the same 3-day inspection to follow. The ordeal of cold water required being bound and cast into a pool that had been blessed by a priest. Sinking meant innocent, because the consecrated water had accepted you. Floating meant guilty, because it had not. A person who sank had to be pulled out quickly. Both outcomes carried a real risk of death. The price of a man, in the ordeal, was no longer money. It was a wound and 3 days, and a priest's interpretation of whether God had shown up. Legal historian Peter Leeson of George Mason University has argued that trial by ordeal may have worked considerably better than it appears, because everyone involved genuinely believed it. A guilty person standing before a priest, about to plunge their hand into boiling water with the sincere conviction that God would expose them, had every reason to confess before it happened. An innocent person, certain of divine protection, stepped forward. The ordeal extracted confessions from the guilty by making the spiritual cost of proceeding unbearable. Priests also controlled the physical conditions. They could adjust the temperature of the water. They could wrap a wound more carefully for someone they believed was telling the truth. The system had flexibility, its written rules never advertised, and that flexibility was itself a form of judgment, human judgment, dressed in divine authority. Then in 1215, Pope Innocent III convened the Fourth Lateran Council and banned clergy from participating in trials by ordeal. Without priests, there was no blessing. Without blessing, there was no sacred authority. Courts across Europe lost their mechanism for resolving contested guilt almost overnight. What replaced it was not obvious. In England, the answer was the jury, but not the jury as we understand it today. Early English juries were not strangers selected for their neutrality. They were neighbors, men from the same village as the accused, who already knew the facts of the case, or believed they did, were summoned to deliver a verdict based on their personal knowledge of the people involved. A jury of your peers, in the 13th century, meant a jury of people who had already formed an opinion about you before they sat down. The accused had traded a priest interpreting a wound for a neighbor interpreting a reputation. Whether that was an improvement depended entirely on what your neighbors thought of you. For lesser crimes, courts did not bother with juries at all. What replaced the ordeal for minor offenders was a post in the market square. The pillory locked the offender's head and hands in place, upright, fully exposed, in the busiest public space available. The stocks locked the feet and left the offender seated. Both were placed at market crosses and church doors and the most trafficked crossroads in town, because the punishment was not primarily physical. It was the community's attention and what the community chose to do with it. In June of 1732, at a busy market square in London, a man named John Waller was locked into the pillory at noon. The crowd began with cabbages and cauliflowers and artichoke stalks. Then they pulled the structure down. Waller's skull fractured in the collapse. As he lay on the ground, people stamped on him until his ribs broke. he was dead within the hour. 2 members of that crowd were convicted of his murder 3 months later. Neither was sentenced to prison. They received their own public punishment and walked back into the street. The price of a man in the pillory was whatever the crowd decided that afternoon. The writer Daniel Defoe was pilloried in London in July of 1703, sentenced for seditious libel after publishing a satirical pamphlet that powerful men had failed to recognize as satire. While waiting in Newgate jail before his sentence, he wrote a poem called A Hymn to the Pillory and had friends distributed across the city before his first appearance. The crowd threw flowers. They drank his health in nearby taverns. The pamphleteer William Fuller, pilloried just weeks before Defoe that same summer, wrote afterward that being pelted with rotten eggs and filth was worse than the 39 separate lashes he had received as part of his sentence. Fuller had no poem and no friends with pamphlets. 2 men, same city, same wooden frame. One left covered in flowers, one left dead in the dirt. The difference had nothing to do with what either of them had done. Onlookers at a pillory were actively encouraged to participate. Rotten eggs, spoiled vegetables, mud, offal, dead animals, and in less restrained moments, stones and pieces of brick. In a society where local reputation determined access to credit, employment, and justice being displayed before the people who knew you as a proven wrongdoer was meant to be the core of the sentence. The physical discomfort was secondary to the social destruction. The court set the term. The street set everything else. By the 1760s, a young man in Milan was trying to write his way out of all of it. On April 12, 1764, Cesare Beccaria watched the public execution of a man named Bartolomeo Luisetti, condemned for sodomy, killed by asphyxiation, and then burned before a crowd in a public square in Milan. Beccaria was 26 years old. He stood there and tried to construct a rational argument for what he was watching. He could not find one. Later that year, he published Dei Delitti e delle Pene, on crimes and punishments, the first full-scale work of penology in European history. Torture produced confessions, not truth, because a person in enough pain will say anything. Public spectacle did not deter crime because what deterred crime was the certainty of being caught, not the severity of what followed. Punishment needed to be proportional, swift, and consistent. The theatrical brutality of the existing system was not only cruel. By Beccaria's argument, it was not even working. Thomas Jefferson copied passages from the book into his commonplace book. The Grand Duchy of Tuscany abolished the death penalty entirely in direct response, the first government in the world to do so. The argument had been made in print. Someone still had to build the physical alternative. In 1786, Pennsylvania sentenced convicted criminals to perform public hard labor on the streets of Philadelphia in distinctive clothing. Prisoners in chains cleared gutters and hauled refuse through the center of the city. The intention was deterrence. Passers-by felt sorry for the men in chains. The spectacle produced sympathy instead of fear, and a group of Quakers who had been watching from the pavement decided they had seen enough. In 1787, the Philadelphia Society for Alleviating the Miseries of Public Prisons was formed, driven by those Quakers and by the physician Benjamin Rush, who had read Beccaria carefully. Remove the criminal from public view, put them in a cell, give them silence and a Bible. They coined the word penitentiary from the Latin for remorse, not suffering, time, and conscience. The price of a man's crime, finally, would be paid in years rather than blood or wounds or the mercy of a crowd. In 1790, the Walnut Street Jail in Philadelphia was converted into the first penitentiary in the United States. 16 solitary cells were built in the yard for the most serious offenders. The jailer, a man named John Reynolds, fought the conversion through political maneuvering for 5 years before it was completed. International visitors arrived through the decade and carried the model back to Europe. By 1797, similar institutions had opened in New York and New Jersey. 16 cells for an institution receiving hundreds of prisoners from across the entire state of Pennsylvania. 2/3 of inmates were not in cells at all. They were crowded into shared rooms, sleeping on bare floors, with no separation between those awaiting trial and those already convicted. By 1800, the reformers who had built the system were already documenting its failure. The isolation that was supposed to produce repentance was not available to most of the people actually inside the walls. Benjamin Rush had proposed something more careful in 1787: classify prisoners by the nature of their crime. Treat those who acted from passion differently from those who acted from habit or calculation. Education, gardens, individualized sentences, almost none of it was ever built. What was built was the cell and the silence and the years. That architecture spread from Philadelphia across the Western world, and in 1829, its fullest expression opened just 2 miles from Walnut Street. Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia was built on total solitary confinement. Every prisoner was alone in a separate cell, eating alone, exercising alone in a private walled yard with a hood over their head when moved through the corridors so they could not see or be seen by other inmates. Charles Dickens visited Eastern State in 1842 and wrote about what he found with an anger he did not bother to conceal. The system, he wrote, was cruel and wrong. The slow and daily tampering with the mysteries of the brain, he argued, was immeasurably worse than any torture of the body. A man who had been held in total isolation for years, Dickens observed, could no longer hold a conversation. He had forgotten how. The Quakers had set out to replace public brutality with private reflection, and had built, by Dickens's account, a machine for destroying minds quietly, out of public view, with the best of intentions. Who gets to set the price? Every generation of reformers believed they had finally found the rational answer. The Quakers at Walnut Street were appalled by what they replaced. Benjamin Rush had read Beccaria and believed that science and conscience together could build something just. And by the standard of what came before, they had. The penitentiary was more predictable than the pillory, more consistent than the ordeal, less nakedly unequal than Weregild. But the question of who gets to set the price and whose life gets priced lowest did not disappear when the door of the cell closed. It just became harder to see. The person standing in that village in the year 900, accused of something they may or may not have done, was not living in a world without justice. They were living in a world where justice had a price, and where someone else always got to set it. That never changed. What changed was who was holding the ledger. Which of these would you have been willing to face, knowing you were innocent? The Weregild, where the outcome depended on your family's wealth. The ordeal, where it depended on a priest and 3 days and a wound. The pillory, where it depended on the crowd. Leave your answer below and say which century you think you would have survived. John Waller did not get to choose. He was locked into the frame at noon in a London market square, and by 2 o'clock he was dead, and the men who killed him walked back into the street, and the square was cleared, and the market went on. If stories like this are what you come here for, subscribe, and there will be a new one waiting for you every week.